Alright, YouTube, we're back. Remake, of course, we're talking about it again. Last video for 2021, of course. We're about to roll into 2022. It's going to be probably equally as terrible of a year. So at the end of each year, a lot of the Japanese devs like to give like a final message for the year, kind of talk about the year potentially, talk about the next year, kind of teasing things or whatever the case. And we got one from Kitase that's pretty interesting. He actually did two separate like interviews / end of the year messages, with one with Famitsu, one with 4Gamer. Now, while we're talking about this at all, is that for one, he does in fact tease some stuff for Remake in 2022. Now, whether or not that is like part 2 or something like that, we'll get to that when we get there. But the other thing is that with these like end of the year messages, we've seen them like matter in the past. In 2018, both Nomura and Kitase gave like an end of the year message or like a keyword or whatever, and Nomura's was 7 and Kitase's was long wait, which of course 2019 is where we got our first trailer for Remake in like 4 years at that point. And then several other trailers in 2019. Of course, the game came out in 2020. So the point of bringing that up from 2018 is that these end-of-the-year messages can be teasing big things. So let's just hop into what Kitase said. So first up with Famitsu, Kitase's keyword for 2022 is the 35th anniversary for the Final Fantasy series as a whole, which is a pretty goddamn big deal. Like, that's crazy to think that the series is that old. That being said, that gives us nothing. Like, there's nothing we can derive from that, because it could be anything. You think of every single Final Fantasy game ever created, it can pertain to this. Like, so we can't look at that and go, maybe there'll be remake news next year, because who knows. So with the 4Gamer interview, this is the quote that people are latching onto. It says, "The world of FF7 restarted with the remake, will continue to expand itself in 2022. I also hope you will enjoy Final Fantasy VII The First Soldier as well." So with a quote like that, you can definitely take it and run with it, and there are people out there doing that, of course. There's several ways you can interpret it, but the main thing that he's saying here is that the world of Final Fantasy VII is going to expand in 2022. Now, whether or not that pertains to Remake, it's hard to say, because he's just saying the world's going to expand for Final Fantasy VII. We know that The First Soldier, as he name drops, is probably going to be getting updates next year. We know that Ever Crisis is coming out next year. Both of those games in their own ways are going to be added to the world of Final Fantasy VII with any sort of like big updates to First Soldier, assuming that they want to add any like story stuff to it, being that it takes place in the past. It's the beginning of the Soldier program. That's going to add to the lore into the world of FF7. And of course, Ever Crisis is going to be retelling the entire FF7 compilation, but they're also going to have brand new stuff in it. And as of right now, all we know about that is that there's going to be new story elements that focus on the origins of soldiers, so maybe that could somehow tie into like the First Soldier game. Maybe where we're not getting a lot of like lore and story with the game itself. Maybe that's what Ever Crisis can do for us. That'd be kind of cool. Seeing like characters and things that are in the First Soldier within Ever Crisis. Speaking of Ever Crisis too, man, we probably haven't talked about this in a little while. Like, this is a game I'm very much looking forward to in the next year. It's weird that this is it. Like, we got this trailer some time ago, and maybe a little bit of updates like earlier this year, but we haven't had anything on this game. Like, we don't know what the hell is going on. When is this coming out? Like, we don't even have like even an idea other than 2022. It could be December 2022. It could be a whole year away still, for all we know. Now, looking back at this quote again, the fact that he does mention Remake specifically, I think is why you can kind of maybe think that something Remake related could happen next year, because he simply could have just said the world of Final Fantasy VII will continue to expand itself in 2022. He didn't have to add in the part in the middle that says restarted with the remake. When I read that and interpret it, the fact that he's talking about the world of Final Fantasy VII expanding, and then he has to give a pause and say that started with the remake, he has to mention Remake when talking about the FF7 world expanding, to me feels like whatever the expansion is going to be is going to pertain to Remake. Now, whether or not that's part 2, that's kind of hard to say as well. The thing is, pretty much all of us do not expect to see Final Fantasy VII Remake next year, 2022, in terms of a release date, especially since we know the 16s should be coming out next year. I think we know we're getting more for that game, like March or something, spring 2022 or something like that. We know we're getting more information for that game. It's got to be dropping next year. If it's not dropping next year, I don't know what the fuck they're doing. But the fact that 16 should be coming out next year, the likelihood of Remake releasing within the same year as 16 is very, very low. So low, in fact, that it's pretty much an impossibility. But that being said, that doesn't mean we can't get trailers and shit for Remake Part 2. That is, of course, a distinct possibility, and that's something that a lot of us think will happen. We're all kind of looking towards, as of right now at least, 2023 being the potential, or at least the earliest release date for Remake Part 2. And if the game's coming out in 2023, then of course we got to be getting trailers and shit in 2022. Something else that I think people need to take note of, that I at least haven't seen like articles and stuff talking about when referencing this Kitase interview. Kitase mentions that next year is the 35th anniversary for the Final Fantasy series. Again, huge accomplishment. It's badass. But it's also the 25th anniversary for Final Fantasy VII. That's a very specific and distinct anniversary. We're talking about a quarter of a century old, man. That's a big deal. So maybe the world expanding or whatever they have planned for FF7 next year could be because of its anniversary. There could also be brand new FF7 related projects coming out next year. We've had that rumor for a while about that, like Final Fantasy VII anime potentially coming to Netflix or whatever. Like, I don't know how credible that is these days, but we talked about that before. That could be a thing next year. There's a lot of potential and a lot of factors that go into the expansion of Final Fantasy VII. Now, as of right now, what we know is that Part 2's happening eventually. We know that First Soldier's already out. Should be getting updates, I would think, in the next year. And we know that Ever Crisis is dropping next year. Those are the facts and what we know are happening. There's also a kind of interesting quote from Kitase talking about Deathloop being his favorite game for the year. And he says, "Time loops have always been popular in movies and novels. There are several games with it too, but I was impressed to see it used so well by an FPS. The online invasion system with Juliana is also praiseworthy." Now look, before we even continue, I'm not going to put too much stock into it, because maybe he just genuinely likes Deathloop. But the fact that we've talked about Remake, different timelines, parallel universes, maybe the planet being on a cycle, on a loop itself, we see with this little brief review of Deathloop that he has an affinity for that sort of thing, so it is kind of interesting. But again, not going to read too much into it. But my dudes, that's going to be pretty much the video, so of course I'm going to pass it off to you guys with this quote from Kitase talking about the world of Final Fantasy VII expanding in 2022. What do you think he's talking about here? Especially since he mentions Remake specifically. At the very least, even if he's just referencing Ever Crisis, that's still, I'm still looking forward to the game, but the fact that we know we're getting more for FF7 next year, that's the important thing here. I'm always down for more Final Fantasy VII. Look, my dudes, here towards the end of the video, we're going to get a little sappy, a little serious, but if you're watching this video, if you've been supporting this channel for the last maybe couple years, even if you're just a newer viewer, you just started watching here towards the end of 2021, I am beyond grateful. But also the fact that you're watching this video means that you're alive. That means you got out of 2021 alive. A lot of people have died in the past 2 years, man. That shit sucks. I haven't personally lost anybody close to me because of COVID and all this other shit. But a lot of people have died, man. And that's terrible and it's tragic. But even if 2021 was a shit year for you, you're still here, you're still breathing, and that's a win. I cannot guarantee that 2022 is going to be any better than 2020 or 2021. But hell, we're all going into that bitch alive. That's a W. My dudes, that's the video. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you guys aren't new. What's the day? More Final Fantasy VII Remake content in 2022. Turn on notifications. Follow me on Twitter, @DaveYT. I'm a Discord. Links to my social networks are in the description and in the outro. Later, guys.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Logain, or leave it like Cobain.